Hi, I'm Regina here, one of the producers of Impromptu. We're in peak summer travel season, which means people are waiting in long lines at airports, dealing with delays and cancellations, and deciding whether or not to throw down a little more money to get a few extra inches of legroom. So today, we're sharing one of our favorite episodes from last year. It's about why airline travel feels so hard these days, and whether there's anything to do to make it more dependable. Here it is.
My husband was actually on a flight once with an emotional support pony.
Whoa.
Which was wearing a diaper.
Wow.
Which I guess is better than the alternative. But yes.
That is not a true story.
It is absolutely a true story.
Wait, you mean like a Shetland pony?
I don't know. I wasn't on the flight. It was some little horse thing.
Yeah, that's a Shetland pony.
Okay. Either way, should not be on a plane with humans.
Little Sebastian from Parks and Recreation. This is Impromptu with Washington Post Opinions, a show where we bring you conversations about the issues we can't stop thinking about. I'm Charles Lane, and this week we're talking about air travel and why the whole system seems so fragile these days. There's delays and cancellations, but also exasperation with the always changing boarding procedures, the increased cost of checking bags, or needing to pay to get a seat that isn't cramped in the back of the plane. Why has airline travel gotten so miserable, and is there anything to do about it? I'm joined by two of my colleagues to discuss.
I'm Catherine Rampell. I'm an opinion columnist. I mostly write about economics, public policy, and related issues.
And I'm Marc Fisher. I'm also an opinion columnist.
So yes, the airlines make billions each year on, quote, extras, things like baggage fees, premium seating options. All those things used to be sort of, things that just went with the ticket. Now they're unbundled. Does that actually have value for customers? Does it give people more choice?
In theory, yes. And so if you subscribe to that whole notion of dynamic pricing and all of the unbundling, you end up in the absolute hellish circumstance of Spirit or Frontier, where everything is a separate charge. I was on a flight on a budget airline to Iceland last year, and they didn't bother even having cushions on the seats. It was just the raw seat that's delivered from Boeing.
The raw seat. I like that phrase. I never heard that before. The raw seat. Okay.
And so that flight to the bottom, that's where you end up. It was sitting on a metal seat and having to pay for water. And next you'll have to pay for the vent over your seat.
That sounds like going to a Commanders game at FedEx Field. You sit on a metal seat and they make you pay for water.
The unbundling is, cynical attempt to say that you're having more choice as a consumer. And yes, if you're 23 years old and traveling with a tissue instead of luggage, then sure, you can get a much cheaper flight on Spirit and be insulted at every step of the way. But for the average passenger, the unbundling just means paying more money and getting it zapped to you at the end of the process rather than with it getting a price up front.
Well, Catherine, you are the resident economics columnist. I'm surely you have a little more sympathy with this effort to harness incentives.
Yeah, I don't have problems with, this kind of price discrimination. And I think it does enable airlines to offer very low price point options that they might not otherwise, which gets people access to services that they might not otherwise have. My complaint is about the transparency. So I don't have a problem with airlines charging more money for different amenities, but I do think that all of that information should be disclosed up front. And there has been some regulatory effort over the years to make sure that happens, like when travel aggregators like Booking.com or Kayak, et cetera, when they index different flight options, they have to include the taxes and fees. Whereas you can, some airlines in the past would have said that, they're only showing the fare price, not the taxes and fees, even though the taxes and fees are required. So I don't have a problem with price discrimination. I think that it does actually enhance consumer surplus for some segment of the population, even if it can be annoying.
Yeah, I agree. I think transparency is a huge issue for me. We live in the age of the teaser price for almost everything. And I have to admit, I'm a sucker for the teaser price. And when I see, I can get to the West Coast for $59, I click on that. And then I realize, no, that's not really what I'm going to pay. And let's shift gears a little bit just to like the physical experience of flying and psychological experience of flying. I mean, Mark, I'm not going to say how old you are, but like me, you're a little tiny bit older than Catherine. How has the experience changed over the course of your lifetime?
Well, I mean, to go back to the ancient era before Jimmy Carter deregulated the airline industry, when you and I were younger, Chuck, prices in the air were pretty strictly regulated. And as a result, the airlines competed primarily by services that they offered. Comfort and quality of food and quality of seats and the amount of leg room and all of that, and the boarding process as well. Then Jimmy Carter said, I'm going to deregulate this and prices are going to come down. And we did have a little period there of actual price competition. And there were discount airlines, People Express and New York Air, or you could choose Trump Airlines and get, leather seats and maybe even get to your destination. And so there was this sort of moment of flowering of choice. But very quickly, with the exception of Southwest, the other airlines decided that they were going to move into this dynamic pricing era of unbundling and all of that. And I think the dream of the deregulation has really been lost. And so you end up with this business that feels like a monopoly because they treat their customers like dirt. Yes, prices are lower than they would have been otherwise, and clearly Americans value that more than almost anything else. I think it's a great economic experiment because what it shows is that price is the determining factor, and we will take any indignity they throw at us in order to get another $8 off the fare.
Yeah, so I think they're only competing on price effectively at this point. And I think airfares are actually remarkably cheap, particularly when you inflation adjust for whatever comparable tickets would have been a couple of decades ago. I can fly one way from New York to California, if I time it right, for like $100, $120. That is insanely cheap when you think about everything that goes into that flight and everything that goes into making that trip happen. So I think the issue is that's what consumers care about. They are sorting by price. If consumers cared about the other stuff, like how they are treated or, I don't know how comfortable the seating options were, then airlines would respond to that, but they don't. This is what passengers pay attention to. I know so many people who say like never again on Spirit Airlines, and then it's like, okay, it's too cheap to pass up, so they do it again. And I think part of what has happened here is that, there's been sort of a race to the bottom on pricing. Fares have gotten very cheap. Coupled with all of that, you have the fact that in like the first decade of this century, airlines overall were losing money. They lost a lot of money. And at some point, around 10, 15 years ago, there was this movement within the industry towards what has been called capacity discipline. So that means essentially that they are flying much fuller flights. So rather than selling out, only 80% of the flight, they're selling out close to 100% or sometimes over 100%, and they're overbooking. That cuts different ways. So you have higher capacity utilization. So fewer seats, but a higher share of those seats actually being occupied. That's very good for airlines, right? It's good for their profits. If the planes are full, it's expensive to fly a half-empty plane a few hours. It keeps their costs down. That's partly what enables them to keep offering cheaper and cheaper tickets. It's a little bit, counterintuitive.
You made me think of this, Catherine. If you were to ask me personally how the experience of flying has changed the most since I started flying, 40, 45 years ago, it would be that you never get on a half-full plane anymore.
Right.
Back then, it was quite common to be one of 20 people on a flight that they just couldn't book. They have really, with the help of sophisticated computing and so on, they've really optimized what you call capacity discipline.
Right. Yeah, so what happens is that means that can make the tickets cheaper on average, but if something goes wrong, people get screwed, right? Because it's not like you can just hop on the next flight where they have a bunch of empty seats. That's why you get these big pileups and delays where if your flight gets canceled, you might have to wait not just hours, but potentially days because there just is not a lot of redundancy built into the system.
And I spent 24 hours in the Seattle airport last winter for precisely that reason. They had nowhere to put us after a cancellation. And so they put us in a hotel, which cost them money. And then they said, no, come on back to the airport. And so it was a total mess. And I think that they actually do this sort of on purpose because I think there is a perverse joy or pleasure of some sort that a lot of passengers get from being treated like dirt because it makes them think they're getting a deal. If they were showering you with decent service and actually having customer service people at the airport during one of these giant pileups, then you would think, well, they're spending all this money on that. I could get a cheaper fare if I go to the airline that treats me like dirt. So I think
do you seriously know anybody who likes being treated badly by airlines?
Jerry Seinfeld built an entire career out of airline jokes about exactly the stuff we're talking about.
But that's because people hate it.
They love to hate it.
Mark, hold on. Mark, do you think one of the reasons they give so little legroom in sort of, ordinary coach is like a business strategy to get people to pay more for a little more legroom?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, they used to have customer service desks at the airport. They still have the desks. They just don't have any people there. And I think that is one way that they show, hey, look, we're economizing in order to give you these low fares.
All right. And we're going to turn to more constructive topics like what could be done to repair or improve the system. But first, we need to take a quick break. Welcome back. I'm Charles Lane, and this is Impromptu. So do you think there are any rules and regulations the government is not enforcing that it could enforce that might make air travel better?
I'm basically on board with enforcing more transparency and helping customers get redress when things go wrong. And the idea of requiring them to build more redundancy into the system so that when things go wrong, there are more options for passengers. I think that's the implicit solution to some of what we've been talking about. I think that could go very badly in the sense that, yes, when things go wrong, you might have better resolutions. But if you require more redundancy in the system, if you require, for example, airlines to run with more excess capacity, that will probably, in the long term, push prices up. So a lot of the solutions that I hear bandied about or that are implicit in the things that people are complaining about, I think might have unintended consequences.
I agree that a lot of the fixes would drive prices up, but I think those prices would be more honest. And I talked to an economist at the University of Kentucky who spends his life studying dynamic pricing and queuing theory and stuff like that. And he said the only answer here is to re-regulate, is to go back and establish certain floors and ceilings of pricing for airlines, and that this would help consumers and would actually help airlines because they'd be able to, set clear prices that they could depend on and actually plan on. And yes, they'd be somewhat higher, but they would actually reflect the cost structure of the airlines, and they would actually reflect what many passengers are already paying once you add in all the absurd fees.
So some people say part of the problem is just consolidation, right? I mean, I guess there are 5 major airlines at this point, and they've taken over, merged with 42 others since 1960. That's even before deregulation. Is this an antitrust thing where we need to sort of break these companies up? Would that serve any purpose?
I have very mixed feelings about this. There has been a lot of consolidation in airlines, but there have also been a lot of airlines that went broke. And it tells you it's a really hard business. Part of the problem is, while there have been new entrants, I recently flew an airline that I had never heard of called Breeze. The newer entrants, like that one, basically can't get slots at the major airports. Like you could, if I wanted to create Catherine Rampell Airlines, it would probably be very difficult for me to get a slot for a major route from like LaGuardia or JFK or SFO. I only have the option essentially to go to like some of the further away regional airports, which fewer people use. And that makes it more challenging. And there are probably different ways that you could, I don't know if democratize is the right word, but you could make it easier to let the legacy carriers compete over those slots in the high demand airports that would help the new entrants gain more of a foothold. But I don't know necessarily that breaking up the airlines absent evidence that, I don't know, that they're really abusing their pricing power for, if they've like really monopolized one particular route, for example. I don't know that that's going to be super helpful because, again, like prices are very, very low. I think it's good that more Americans at lower income levels are able to fly.
Let's get your takeaways. What's the big picture takeaway, Mark, after all this griping and a little bit of constructive discussion?
The nation's airways are like a bargain basement department store. It's a place where you can get a lot of cheap prices and you don't really know what you're getting, but it'll probably get you there eventually. And at the same time, it's a miserable experience. And whether it's intentionally miserable or accidentally miserable, it's miserable. And so I think a lot of Americans would be open to some basic structural changes, except they'd be so fearful that prices would go up that they'd say, no, treat me like dirt. That's what I really prefer.
Catherine?
Again, I am skeptical that people like being treated badly. I guess what I would say is we have a very congested system. Again, no slots at the major airports. Airplanes are very full. It would be better for each of us individually if fewer people traveled, right? Like we would all have a better experience if we were competing with fewer fellow passengers. But in aggregate, it's a good thing that a lot of people have access to inexpensive travel, even if that experience often leaves much to be desired.
I confess, I am an apologist for commercial aviation, and let me tell you why. A lot of people start the narrative with deregulation in 1970. I started with the invention of commercial aviation in the 1930s, when it was prop planes at low altitude. Inside, it was noisy. You could hear the engine. It was freezing cold. The person sitting next to you was chain smoking with the encouragement of the airline. By the way, that's another thing that's changed in our lifetimes. There's no more ashtrays. And as you say, Mark, it was a miserable experience reserved only for the wealthy few who could afford it. Now, at least, we have this fantastic jet service that serves everyone, not just a wealthy handful. It's extremely complex, capital intensive and everything else, and they pull it off with more safety than ever. The safety of this extraordinary complex system is kind of mind-boggling when you really think about it. So yes, all of these annoyances are real. I repeat, I can't stand the boarding process. I hate it when somebody clonks me in the head with their overhead luggage. But when you consider how far we have come within a century, it is pretty staggering. When I think about the alternatives, I always come back to my experience flying in communist countries. I flew from Havana to Camagüey, Cuba once, and it was on an old Soviet Ilyushin jet. The plane was packed, and I looked up ahead of me in the cabin, and the fire suppression equipment was attached to the wall, and it included a fire extinguisher and an axe. An axe, just in case we needed to chop our way out of a fire. And this axe was held on by a lightweight vinyl strap and one button to this wall. So off we go down the runway. And sure enough, at the very last minute, the pilot has to abort the flight. And we come to this screeching halt. And I heard this loud noise, and I looked back, and sure enough, the axe had, gone all the way through the cabin and come to rest at the back with a loud clunk. So yes, government regulation is necessary, but in countries where they do a little bit too much of it or they do it stupidly, it can create unintended consequences. And with that absurd, lengthy anecdote, we have to wrap this up. Thank you both for being a part of this week's episode of Impromptu. Let's do it again soon.
Thanks, Chuck. It was a lot of fun. I want to go back on Aeroflot so I can get beer in a can with a glass, made of glass. And I guess, a goat and a dog in the seats next to me.
Thanks, Chuck. Always a pleasure, even if airline travel is not.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson and me, Regina DeHere. Edited by Demir Marusic, Chris Solentraub, and Allison Michaels. It was mixed by Emma Munger. Thank you for listening to this episode of Impromptu. As always, let us know what you thought of the conversation and what you think we should talk about next. Email us at impromptu@washpost.com. See you next week.